It's Tuesday, April 8th, 2014, and you're listening to SYN Boldly, the podcast, the Sign Your Name Project. I'm your host, Trey Comstock, and with me this week is more than the entire team. We have Miss Kathleen Royston.
Hello.
We have Mr. Stephen Doss.
Hello.
We're also joined by a Candler colleague of mine, Jessica.
Hi.
On this week's show, we will be talking about having an extended discussion and many interviews after the extended discussion on the issue of migration, and particularly illegal immigration in the United States. So we're going to start tonight by letting Jessica introduce herself briefly before we move into our discussion. So Jessica, tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of what brings you to the show.
Okay, thank you so much for having me on the show tonight. I am a first-year MDiv at Candler School of Theology. And I come to a place of immigration a little bit more from an advocacy side. Last year I spent a year in D.C. working for faith-based advocacy organization, and so we did a lot of top-level work on the immigration bill, organizing people to come to D.C. and speak to their congressional representatives, and really trying to pass the immigration bill just nationally. And so that's kind of where I come into the immigration bill, or immigration issue, from that side.
Excellent. And so from there, as you can kind of hear from Jessica's intro, we will be talking about immigration, and particularly the effects on the migrants themselves in this week's discussion. We've talked about this a little bit on the show before. I know Stephen and I did an episode that touched on migration before I left for Tucson, Nogales. But I want to start tonight's discussion by kind of just going around the circle and talking about a little bit about how we each arrive at caring about this issue of migration. Because I think we each have our own journeys in that regard, and I think it's interesting to look at each person's story and how we got there before we launch into a discussion of kind of the social justice and theological implications of kind of the current state of migration in the United States. So Kathleen, let's start with you. Kind of how do you arrive at this issue?
I grew up in a suburb north of Chicago that was a predominantly Jewish suburb. And next door, literally, to the town I grew up in was another town that had historically been Italian, and had over time sort of changed from being a predominantly Italian community to a predominantly Mexican community. And so I grew up with these issues. We all went to the same schools. And so I heard lots of stories about this. I grew up with Spanish speakers in the Chicago area. And so that experience and getting to know people and getting to know stories was definitely part of what prompted me to do what I did in college. And I have a degree in Spanish and Latin American and Caribbean studies. And so I speak Spanish. Immigration has always been something that I cared about. And so I interned with an organization in Atlanta that worked with Spanish speakers, and did quite a bit of work with them. And really what I have done is heard stories. Mm-hmm. And because I speak Spanish fluently, I've heard some different stories. And then when I graduated from college, I worked for a while at a legal aid office that worked with H-2B farm workers, which are the legal farm workers, and in Georgia, and did employment. I was a paralegal, and it was employment law, basically. And then after that, I worked for several nonprofits, and so worked with the Spanish-speaking community in Atlanta. So I go pretty deep into this issue. It's been a part of my life for a long time. And I'm from a family that has very different views on it than I do.
So Stephen, especially having grown up in Alabama, given where laws are there in regards to immigration, tell me how you kind of interface with this issue.
Well, I'm very much, unlike Kathleen, I'm a surface scratcher. It hasn't really been an issue in my community growing up in Alabama because you were all poor. We had a few that we knew. They went to our school, and no one cared at the time. I don't know how that's changed because I haven't been back since the legislation has passed. But I do know that it caused a big rift between the more progressive churches and the more evangelical churches, to use their own naming,
their own
labels, and how this has causes a split overtly between the two sides in Alabama. I don't know where it is anywhere else, but I know from hearing some of my pastor friends in Alabama talk. But growing up, you never had that in my community. You never had that. Oh, they're this, they're that, they're this, they're that, because they just were classmates. However, on a more governmental scale, you could tell that there was pushback, and seeing how that affected your friends that you went to Spanish class that were getting A's when you were getting B's.
You're getting B's in Spanish?
Yes.
You're much better than I am.
Okay. But seeing how that affected them, and how, you were afraid that you weren't going to see them in class the next day because of the way people were being pushed. And then, when I went to college, I had the opportunity to work in Juarez, Mexico, right on the border. I built a house next to the fence, so I got to see Las Cruces, New Mexico, which is a very you could see 3-story houses from the 1-story house that we were building that had 2 rooms, that had the that you cooked outside in a tin drum.
Sure.
And you
could see kind of the different, the kind of the stark realities of the different sides of the
and
border.
how it's shown every day, unintentionally, because it's right across the street. El Paso is across the bridge.
Yeah.
Which, again, there's some pretty nice houses there, and when you have to go there to go to the Walmart, when you have to cross the border to go to the store because your city doesn't have one in your neighborhood. Yeah.
Well, I mean, El Paso has its own problems, but in comparison, even to Ciudad Juarez, the difference is stark.
Yeah.
So, Jessica, how do you kind of arrive at this issue?
So I think I arrive at this issue a little bit differently, but because growing up, I didn't really deal that much with immigration issues. But I think that I come at it from a point of just of my faith and being called to love the stranger and love the immigrant, and what does that mean? And also, I just have a really strong passion for social justice, and so when I see human rights being violated, or I see something that's unjust, like I would consider the immigration system in America, then I'm looking at what are ways that I can fix this, and what is my place in that as a person of faith? What is God calling me to do or be in the situation? And so I think I come at it from a more of loving others, and what does that mean as we're trying to create a more just and equal society?
Absolutely. And I think, you bringing up this issue particularly of a just and equal society brings me to kind of where I want to take this discussion, which is this idea of looking at kind of the theological implications, both of how migration is currently being approached and what are different visions of how it can be approached. So kind of what do y'all see as the theological implications for how, not necessarily specifically American churches, but the United States in general, how it approaches specifically undocumented migration?
Well, I guess I'll start, being the biblical literalist here. I grew up Church of Christ, so that is why I say that. Anywho, there's a law in the Levitical law code that says you treat the alien as you would treat a citizen because you were once strangers in a strange land as well. And I think for people who, let's be honest, it's going to be more of the conservative, we take Leviticus literally on most things except the things we don't agree with.
Sure.
They're going to, and it's like you can't proof text any more than say that. It's like, no, we're called to treat everyone as equals in this country.
And it's not just in the Levitical law codes. It's all over.
Yeah.
It's all over
Jebus
the Old
says
Testament.
it.
Yeah, it's...
Jesus, sorry, not Jebus.
I think you bring up an interesting point that this would be one of those interesting ways to have a biblical literalism discussion, right?
Yeah.
You say, okay, you take the Bible literally, what what are your thoughts of integration? And if it is like, let's build a wall bigger, then you are really not, like, don't give me Leviticus 14:22 unless you're going to wrap the rest of Leviticus
Exactly.
in this.
But then, you get the problem with it's like, well, that was because they were... They will bring out the context.
They're going to bring out
I'm
the
like,
context
whoa,
then.
for that verse is the context. It's like, no, because they didn't have to deal with the issues, and it's just not safe anymore. And now we have defined nations rather than tribes, and it was about tribes, and they were still Jewish. I've heard it all.
Sure, yeah, I'm sure.
One time someone brought up the interstate system as a reason
The what
why.
now?
The interstate system.
Unpack that for me.
Because
Say more about that.
Okay. Because transportation now across borders is so much easier. With like you can take I-10, get on some other road, and yeah. And
But I mean, you could take like 85 from here to Richmond.
exactly, take 85 from here to Richmond. It was like, because they were so close together, if someone was crossing the borders, they were probably still like you. They were probably still Jewish. They were close to the border anyway, so you just pop them over, and it's okay.
I understand that argument,
It's
but
not like a Costa Rican came.
But it fundamentally misunderstands what they meant by foreigner. Foreigner meant non-Jew.
Yeah.
Like definitionally, foreigner meant non-Jew.
Yeah.
Because if it would not have been an issue for them to care for the other Jews, that was the obvious bit. The unobvious bit, the bit that the prophets and the Levitical holiness cult was worried about, was caring for the folks that are unobvious.
Yeah.
Caring for the folks that don't appear to be like you, of giving the humanity and the care to those who you wouldn't obviously already care for. There's a line in the gospel that I'm going to misquote, that, sinners already care for their friends and family. That's not a problem. What I'm calling you is, love the people who are harder to love, or are so different that it doesn't seem like you should love them.
I think in addition to all of the sort of law code business, I think this brings up really interesting questions about the image of God. One of the bumper stickers that I've seen says in Spanish, "No human being is illegal."
See,
yeah, and I think that for people of
that
faith,
language
that brings up some really powerful stuff, like who determines who is of sacred worth and who is not, and this is my own bias, but I think that language has a lot to do with that. And shared humanity across cultural divides, geographic divides, and linguistic divides. And I could not be a bigger proponent for bilingual education. And talking about it in church, I think, matters too. Because it's one thing to see sort of like faceless mass of quote-unquote illegals, whatever the hell that means. And it's very different if you take the time to learn a language and spend time listening to other people. And I think that, for me, that has a lot to do with Pentecost. And that, what does it mean that the Holy Spirit equips us to speak love to a hurting world in the language that they can understand? And I take that probably quite literally as someone who has a degree in a language, but I mean, I have to wonder, like, that has been, at least in my own life, that has been such a powerful thing. And I think that maybe churches really reaching across that, I think that a lot of churches do English classes, but I wonder what it would be like
to do
if
Spanish.
Churches offered Spanish classes as a sign of love to a neighbor.
Where's my devil's advocate hat? There it is.
Oh gosh.
But
Lord Jesus.
but we're not coming to them; they're coming to us. And yes, I intentionally use them and us.
Sure, yeah,
because
I get that.
okay, all right, devil advocate hat.
So
off.
I mean,
Discuss.
I get that
So when everybody's gathered in Jerusalem for Pentecost, bam, Bible.
she defeats your literalism with her literalism. Score 1 for literalism.
I don't think that's ever been said about me before, ever.
No, part of interpretation is deciding what you do and do not take literally. I mean, that is the nature of interpretation, is that, like we've talked about this before in the issue of the bodily resurrection of Christ, that, the three of us, being Kathleen, Stephen, and I, side that, that is a part that we happen to take literally. That we look at the story of Christ and we go, what makes sense for us is to literally interpret that. And so it's not that in, being not a biblical literalist, that nothing is literal.
It's true. It's true.
This is not Assassin's Creed where nothing is true and everything is permitted.
Wrong podcast.
Oh, wrong podcast. That's the tech show, right?
Bunny trail, y'all.
Oh, yes.
So, Jessica, kind of throw to you. I know we do this so much. It's just kind of we go, and it's hard to jump in. So, what's your perspective on this issue of the relation of theology, social justice, and migration?
So I think there's like a lot of good comments that were brought up, and I was just thinking, but I think that something that's really important to me in my faith, and I keep coming back to, is relationship. Mm-hmm. And so, in genuine relationship. And so I feel like when we're talking about what does it mean to, welcome the stranger or love our neighbor or accept them, and we want to talk about what does that really mean, I think it comes back to relationship. So whether that means learning a new language or extending that hand and asking yourself, like you were saying earlier, where is the face of God in this? And if we believe that everyone is God's children, which I feel like most evangelicals would say, like we're all God's children, everyone in the world, we have to go save everyone in the world, they all need Jesus. Then if that's true and we believe that and we want to go and save the world, then that would also include these people that are coming here, would it not? And so
in fact, that'd make it easier.
Right.
They're quite literally showing
Mission.
up.
Right, more people for us to convert, right? Yeah.
You fit in well.
So I think that it comes back to just like relationship and what does that look like and what does that mean for us and our call to love others. If we just want to come back to like the core before we even jump into like social justice. So like we're just trying to bring people in, just wade them in. We can start with like relationship and building relationships, and then we can start moving towards, okay, so now this is wrong. Let's start working towards that, because some people they're not ready to really like jump in to say like this is unjust, but they're like, okay, we can build relationships with these people.
And I think you raise an interesting point given the experience that kind of Jessica and I have recently gone on. You're going to be hearing later in the show from a whole bunch of folks who also went on this experience. But a few weeks back, over Candler's spring break, Jessica and I went to Tucson and Nogales and went and visited, met with folks kind of living on the border, on both sides of the border. And met with a wide range of folks who had made the crossing and been deported, folks who are in the process of maybe being deported, maybe receiving asylum, this wonderfully straight-talking judge who, while controversial, was also controversially hilarious. We got to witness Operation Streamline in action, which is kind of the systematic criminalization of folks on the border. We met with a whole wide variety of folks on many sides of the issue around this idea of relationship and us having a relationship with those people and with that place and the impact that can have as we move forward in ministry. So I think it is important, and I want to kind of ask you a question, Jessica, that I'll be asking other folks as this podcast goes on. Kind of what was transformative for you out of that experience?
Okay, so really two things stand out for me. We did a desert walk, I believe, on the second day that we were there.
Sure, yeah. We walked about 4 or 5 miles in the Arizona desert.
And they had 3 markers of grave sites for 3 bodies that were found in the desert. And these bodies were found within walking distance, within eyesight of houses and civilization. And so just to think how far that each of these individuals had traveled, we're not sure, but I can imagine, and I'm guessing that it was a very long journey for these people to make it here to America. And so just the idea of being so close, being able to see houses and see lights and know that there's life right there, and not being able to make it, and what that must have felt like. And just what that means, that for whatever reason they felt they couldn't continue, or they couldn't go to these houses if they needed something, if they were hurt, if they needed water, for whatever reason, they felt that they were going to die here when civilization was right there. And so this idea is sticking with me of people that are suffering or dying or need help, and they're right there. Mm-hmm. And for whatever reason, I'm not reaching out, or they're not reaching out to me. And so that's really stuck with me, of like, who is right on my doorstep that I am not, either I'm not reaching out, or they feel like they can't come and reach to me. So that's one thing. And then the other thing that stuck with me was the detention center that we went to. And just the experience of being in the detention center and learning more about for-profit prisons. I know a lot, well, not a lot, but a good bit about mass incarceration and for-profit prisons, and just seeing the intersection of immigration detention centers also in that. And so this idea that these people are worthless to us in the desert, they should die, they shouldn't be coming, you shouldn't be helping them, you shouldn't be putting out water, you can't transport them, this is awful. But as soon as we catch them, well, then we want them to keep going through our system because we can make money off them then.
Yeah, and there was one of the perspectives we heard in that was this kind of very troubling statement that the only value that these people seem to have to our government is as prisoners.
Right.
Like, they get dehumanized and they get treated as if they are of no value, but they feed money into the prison industrial complex, and so that gives them value. And I when I heard that, I sat back and went, oh, wow. Yeah. That is deeply troubling.
Yeah, it's really, to me, it's really saddening that we're like dehumanizing people so much to commodify them, and then seeing the streamlined system and seeing them just basically like cattle just go through the system. It's just really shocking. It'll stay with me for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for sharing that. I see a chalkboard conversation happening over on the other side. In the studio, our studio table is also a chalkboard.
That's where we do Stephen Splains.
That's where we do Stephen Splains, another show we just launched. And so, what is happening over on the chalkboard? I see that it is appropriate.
Well, Trey.
Yeah, let's talk about the chalkboard.
No, I don't want to cut into your experience
because this conversation is great.
I just thought about how we talk about borders, we talk about them being absolute, like they are fixed realities, and they're totally artificial.
Just look at Russia.
Human.
Africa.
Africa.
It's like, and they're
Sudan,
shifting,
South
and they're
Sudan,
moving, and
West
they're
East Sudan.
political, and they're human constructs. Like, those are not, like, the border isn't a thing. It's not real. It's a line on a map. And
it was decided mostly by a war.
Right. Yeah. Or several in the case of
Mexico.
Yeah, or it's like, here's 25 minutes. Now you're taking 10 for it.
And so I think that that's something in all of this to maybe, particularly from a faith perspective, to keep in mind is what is human constructed,
sure.
like what is a human invention, and I think borders are human divisions. They're the lines that we put up to divide ourselves from other people, which sounds an awful lot like SYN to me.
Yeah.
And then I went in because I'm a jerk.
Well, we knew. Yes. Okay. Confirmed.
Yes,
I quoted Hemingway. Is it Hemingway or Frost? I think it's Frost.
Frost.
It's Frost.
That's
Yeah.
Frost.
Frost.
That's not even what that poem's about. But
I know it's not what that poem's about, but that's a quote that I hear a lot.
Yeah.
Good fences make good neighbors. Good fences make good neighbors.
But I don't actually think that's true. I don't think that's true.
Well,
that's stupid. Shove it, Robert Frost.
As aphoristic as that sounds, just because it's short and pithy doesn't make it true.
Well, I think the mentality is like, yes, when we can work together, but in the end, I want to be on my side and you should be on yours.
But that's not Christian.
It's not
even
Christian
remotely.
at all. I don't know why they bring it up, but that's just...
No, but I understand that this isn't your point of view,
okay,
but
good,
I want to
good.
refute
I feel like
that.
I'm
That
being
is
punched in the face.
Yes. Later I will actually do that too.
My whiskers will hurt you.
I think the other thing, and this is like me being a total Latin American studies dork, but most of the American Southwest was Mexico way before it was America.
Yes.
And so you have families that have been on that land for generations and generations and generations. And so identity, I think, particularly in that area, is not nearly as fixed as I think politically we would like to think of it.
And I think something that twigs for me is I stood in Nogales and I saw Bethlehem. So my background is I did some peace and reconciliation work in Israel and Palestine back during the Gaza uprising in 2009. And so we spent a lot of time out of our base of operations in Bethlehem, which is on the other side of the Israel wall. And I stood there, and there's a wall that separating people from what used to be their family's land. That wall is constructed across family farms. People have to cross through a border checkpoint in order to work their land and often lose their land that way, which is kind of, I argue, part of the point, is to get that land. And I stood in Nogales, and I'm standing there, I'm looking at America, and it's yet another wall that my tax dollars have made. And I felt that same kind of feeling that this was, I kind of think that with immigration, legal and not, the Southwest is just kind of going back to how it should be, which is this kind of, the folks who have been there for centuries, the mestizo, the folks who belong there. It's their land. The vast influx of Caucasian Americans into Arizona is a relatively recent construct because they realized it was a nice place to retire given the vague absence of seasons.
Yeah.
Right? But that is not a natural state for that land. I walked out with a tremendous sunburn, which proves that genetically I do not belong to that place. I just don't.
Oh.
I mean, so I think I read a book before going by a guy named Nevins, who kind of talks about border as an artificial concept. And that really it should be kind of like that Mexico slowly fades out and America slowly fades in. And with this concentration on border security, we have like this hard line literally in the sand and the rocks and the mountains that says, here is America, and it's very America. And here is Mexico, and it's muy Mexicano. And I tried. It wasn't great.
Terminó mal.
But that this is totally constructed rather than kind of an actual fact. And to kind of, this conversation could go on for days, and this podcast is quite literally going to go on for days, because I have already recorded an hour and a half of interviews that will follow this segment. But I want to pitch it around in kind of a two-part question. This is actually what I finished each of the interviews. So, no, these are the interviews that are recorded are coming after, but I actually recorded them before.
Science is hard.
Science is hard.
Explain it.
I'm removing all the magic. But a question I've asked that I will ask each of them, and I want to ask to y'all is, first part of this is, what should people know that you don't think they already know? Assuming that they're not read up on this issue and have not just kind of been trapped in this issue, as Kathleen has been for years, and Jessica has also been for years, and I just kind of grew up around it, as did Stephen. What are some things that people should know that you don't think they already know? And then the next question, have in the back of your mind, is what can the church do about this? So step one, what should people know?
Okay. I guess everyone's looking at me. I have no idea why, but
just explain things.
I can kind of go first.
Please
I guess.
do.
Yes.
So what do I think people should know? I think that the first thing that people should know is that first and foremost, immigrants are people. And I think a lot of times that's forgotten. Mm-hmm. And so these are people that have, mothers and fathers, sons, daughters, and that the first and foremost, they have hopes and dreams just like the rest of us, you know. They want to be able to be successful and have a happy life and provide for their families and enjoy the same things that we want to enjoy. And so I think the first thing that people know, but they forget, is just the humanity, the shared humanity in all of us, and that's really a starting place. And as for the church, I think that what the church can do is just educate more people about the actual facts of the issue. And so taking away all of the both sides, but just educating what's actually going on, what are the facts, and then what do we think our call as a church community is around this issue. Because there may be some churches where immigration is not a big deal in their communities, or it's not really affecting them. So maybe it's not as big of an issue, but maybe there's just education. So we educate ourselves around this. Okay. And there may be other parts of the church where they're like, oh no, we can really advocate, or we can start a new ministry around this. But I think first and foremost, it starts with this education, really asking yourselves, what does the Bible say about immigration? And then what are we called to do from that place? Absolutely. I appreciate that perspective. Definitely. Kathleen or Stephen, what is one thing people should know? And then what can the church do about it?
I guess I'll go. One thing that people should know is that cultural diversity isn't a bad thing. The United States is one of the, in all honesty, very few culturally heterogeneous countries. You're not going to go to France and hear they're French, they're Polish, they're Japanese, they're Korean. the United States has such a good, rich history of supposedly being welcoming. And I think we lost that. I think that we're trying to latch onto this vague concept of American, which is ironically white.
Yeah,
And
which is...
Oh.
That was gonna. Sorry, keep going. That's gonna be my point. So
Okay, yeah.
just appetizer,
So-
guys.
Ellipses on that one. Kathleen Royston will continue. But being different isn't bad.
Sure.
And all we're doing is getting richer by allowing, and I'm saying allowing like we have a big gate and there's a drawbridge and a moat, which there kind of is. By allowing people to come and live their lives and be themselves here. And I think, as one of the few countries that seemingly embraces that, even though there's been a huge pushback, we need to accept that and say it's a good thing, because it is. Yeah. And what should churches do? I think churches need to get louder on it. I know that United Methodist Church just had a couple bishops arrested.
Yes. We talked about that
a few weeks ago. Yeah.
So excited.
Yeah. Protesting in front of the White House, asked to leave. The generic protester gets arrested thing.
We all need to meet Bishop Carcaño. She sounds amazing.
She's a badass. She just is.
Yes. But the thing is, that's great. That's just one church. That's just one bishop. And it was misconstrued. I think I saw on Facebook, one of my Facebook friends is the head of the General Board of Church and Society who is responsible for... Sorry, I'm going to be banging for a job up there. So
Should start banging for some fundraising up there.
Maybe, potentially. And it just slipped. Sorry. Anywho, yeah, but that's just one church. That's just one bishop, and news outlets said it was because of some legislation, not the fact that there was 2 million deportations in Barack Obama's presidency, which is much more than any other president.
He's going for a record.
He's gonna win it.
He's gonna get the record. I think. Him and Babe Ruth.
Yeah. So I think churches need to get louder. Churches need to say, okay, this is one thing where we can't take a stand on whatever our theological bent is, because it's biblically literal. It's social justice-y.
This should be one that evangelicals should be all over.
All over.
White on rice.
Yes.
Especially since, a lot of evangelical churches have been reaching out to Spanish-speaking
and
communities.
Actually, that's a huge growth area all throughout Latino America, and Mercosur is evangelicalism. It's huge. It's, Catholics are holding summits about how concerned they are. It is a huge growth sector there and in Africa of the kind of that mixture of Pentecostal and Baptist worship is, huge.
Yeah.
I think what also this conversation forces is conversations about race.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If this was an influx of British
Canadians.
people or Canadian, Canadians.
But I don't know. I think we're just really bad we discriminate against whoever comes next, because I remember my Scots-Irish ancestors got prohibition slapped on them.
It's because they were Catholic.
It's because they were Catholic.
But I do have to feel I feel like a lot of these conversations,
part of it is race. Absolutely.
It's a bunch of brown people.
Yeah.
And
that's the color of terrorists, so they probably are.
Well, it's just not apparently not the color of America.
Yeah.
Right, because America, which is
ludicrous.
But so I think that and the bishops being politely asked to cease and desist,
and then arrested.
Right,
politely.
That stuff happened in the civil rights movement too.
Yeah.
And so I think that these conversations,
later from a Birmingham jail.
Yeah.
Right, you can't. Well, and the Methodist bishops got
some of them.
Including our very own Bishop Woody White.
Yes.
Before he was a bishop, but he did get arrested in Mississippi.
Bishop Woody White is awesome.
Speaking of badasses. Anyway.
Friend of the show.
I would love to have Bishop Woody White. I would need to really adjust the bass on the thing, but I would love to have Woody White on. He would come.
He's so great. Anyway, but this conversation, like, we also, I think in the church it makes us also face our own not so great record on this. And I think that's a repentance thing too.
Absolutely.
And so I think that in this conversation, you know, obviously, I think that talking about the image of God is very important. I think talking about shared humanity is very important. I think talking about narrative is very important. But I also think talking about race is really important. Yeah. And looking at that.
At this point, we're going to throw to the kind of series of pre-recorded interviews with other people who were on the experience in Tucson and Nogales with me. You'll hear a wide variety of perspectives. Also, Jimmy, my co-host from the tech shows, also makes an appearance to offer his perspective as a person who works in engineering in Houston and is heavily involved in the construction industry there. And so thus hires a lot of migrant folks and is, you know, kind of tied into the industry in that way. So he makes an appearance as well. So at this point, I will throw to that. Through the magic of editing, that's what you should be hearing now. And now I'm with Randy Perdue and Jimmy Principe. Randy is one of my colleagues from the Church on the Border seminar and from Candler School of Theology. And Jimmy is an engineer in Houston, Texas, who I do a number of shows with on technology. And also his industry as a mechanical engineer heavily relies on migrant labor. And Randy is also a pastor of a church in North Carolina. So he has quite the commute to get to Candler. And I thought mine was bad. So Randy, if you'll briefly just kind of introduce your connection to migration, both as part of the trip, and as just in general before and after the trip, and then I'll ask the same question to Jimmy.
Okay, my basis started years ago with a former career and dealing with some Latino folks in financial transactions, but the perspective from the Church on the Border with the readings that we've been reviewing was really opening my heart and my mind to trying to dig into these real life experiences that these folks experience daily. And as good as the readings were, to be able to get to travel to Tucson and Nogales and just to spend some time, although it brief, with these lovely people, it was a definitely life changing experience for me to get time on the ground and to see these realities, but to see the hope that these people have and the smiles and just showing us, you know, how we should live life and live life together was a fantastic opportunity.
And I kind of pose the same question to you, Jimmy. Jimmy, obviously you didn't go on the trip. You were working.
Yeah, it turns out.
Not that we weren't working, but in a different way. What is kind of your experience in connection to the issue of migration?
I mean, you know, as being in the construction industry in Houston, it's a huge part, and not even just in Houston, in Texas as a whole, it's a huge part of the actual people that do the manual labor that gets things built. We often joke about it in our office that, you know, you have to make sure that whoever it is that's actually doing the work will understand what it is you're drawing, not the, you know, at least high school, if not college educated person that is technically hired to do it. And it's like Spanish is an extraordinarily well looked upon skill for people to have because of the number of migrant workers. And you see them when you're on construction sites and you know that they're there, and it's this like dirty little secret of the industry that's not even a secret that no one talks about.
In terms of the laws of Texas, I know here in Georgia and in Alabama there are kind of very increasingly restrictive legislation as in regards to hiring folks who are undocumented. I know you're not directly involved in the hiring of contract labor, but do you know of any kind of legal issues in Texas that people run into on a state level?
I think that okay, so, you know, fact checking is a death podcast, so I didn't do any. But I think that the way that it works in Texas is that so there's not really unionized labor in Texas. I mean, there are union contractor shops, and then there are non-union contractor shops. But I don't think Texas as a whole, they've worked very hard to stay away from that kind of rhetoric.
Sure.
Because, well, okay, with the exception of Ted Cruz, because he's insane.
Yeah, well, okay.
But
I could have an entire show dedicated to attempting to account for Senator Cruz.
he's insane. He's a Cuban from Canada that doesn't understand what he's doing. But anyways, sorry, was that an opinion? Didn't mean for that to slip out. No, it's, with the exception of Ted Cruz, who's very, very much about the restriction of undocumented workers in the United States as a whole and in Texas, there's not really... Everyone understands that the people that cut your lawn, the people that build your houses, the people that do all of the work that no one else wants to do are all undocumented. And that's where they're coming from. They're all undocumented. It's one of the reasons why construction is so cheap in Texas.
Yeah, and it's been booming.
Oh, yeah, and it's like in Houston in particular right now, the industry is just insane. And I'm going to give you a hint. They're not coming from, Texas towns.
Sure, they're coming from Nogales, and they're coming from Ciudad Juarez, and they're coming from Mexico DF. Like, this is, that is definitely the reality. Thank you for that. So, Randy, you talked about how the Church on the Border and experiencing that on the ground was life-changing. Can you talk a little bit, in this very seminary way, can you talk about in what regard that was life-changing and how that altered your perspective?
Well, first off, and to me the easiest part is, I guess when we here in the States sometimes still think we have the right to define who our neighbor is. And with the perspective of traveling down the highways and experiencing some of the realities along the communities in Tucson, but then when you cross over the border site down and going into Nogales, I mean, again, it's amazing you still see so many happy people, but the reality that they have to face every day and the pricing that they have to go through with the labor salaries that they earn, it's that gap between the haves and the have-not gets so much wider because, when you're looking at roughly $150 to $200 a month based on their average minimum wage, it's just gets to be insane what those folks are doing to have to survive to put food on the table.
Well, it's not even that they're being paid less. That money, the prices for basic goods are actually more expensive. Mm-hmm. So in places like Kenya, many of the basic goods are kind of priced in accordance with basic salaries, so that although living day to day is still living day to day, it's a little more doable. In Mexico, especially in Nogales where we were, the a basic grocery list would cost about 130% of a minimum wage salary. In Mexico, that same list would cost 30% of a minimum wage salary in the United States. While that's still a lot and still untenable, living minimum wage is still very hard in the United States. It's that same amount of money buys a lot more on this side of the border than it does on the other side of the border.
And we, the reality that we've seen also is that if the folks who are close enough to the border communities who can cross over, they've been restricted even more so in the last several years about what they can take back without paying additional taxes. So, and whether that be on groceries or things you mentioned about construction. If you have someone that's in the construction business who decides to go over and buy some lumber, that's even become more restrictive. So it's a constant battle of what you can and can't do going across that borderline. And the reality that those men and women face just for daily survival is just, to me, it's just brutal because we are still a land of some harsh realities ourselves, but there's so much excess in this country. It just the gap is just brutal. The gap is brutal. Definitely.
Is there anything in particular that you saw over there? Either on the Nogales side, we were in Nogales for about 2 days, or on the Tucson side, that's really stuck with you, that really had a particular impact?
I guess one of the things is when we were over in Nogales, when we were standing up on that hillside, looking over at the huge factory.
So we were up on to give some context. One of the things we were able to see is we went to this kind of hillside at sunset where you can see kind of a working class neighborhood in Nogales. You can see more of an upper class or manager's neighborhood in Nogales, and then this gigantic master lock factory. Yeah. One of the larger factories I've ever seen that wasn't making aircraft.
It was just a huge facility, and from what we were told, we didn't get to go inside of that one, but evidently, it's a decent paying facility because obviously it's owned by Americans. But then again, when you turn immediately, as we were looking at that, if we turn to your left and see this neighborhood is more like a government housing, which didn't seem too bad, but it was kind of expensive, and the I call them more like an apartment, but they were kind of small. But you turn back up the hill to the right, and you have this very upscale, very exclusive neighborhood for the management of these different type of factories down there. And they're gated communities. They have all the amenities that most of us would just, consider here normal for a middle-class neighborhood. And then if you turn immediately around behind you, you have this massive set of just barely the most basic type of living places you can see, and some would even call them slums, extending in just as far as you can see, and that's where many of the workers would live. And for them, the amenities would basically be, if you're lucky, you might have electricity and some access to water, not meaning there's actually plumbing in the house, but now they weren't just like lean-tos, don't get me wrong, but they were basically just a lot of them cinder block buildings and shells with the roof on them.
Yeah, it looked actually very similar to the neighborhood I worked in Paraguay. This past summer. It was very much like Bañado Sur, which hopefully, once my documentary gets done, more of y'all will be able to see. But it reminded me a lot of this kind of improvised settlement that was built by the people. The infrastructure was put in by the residents rather than the government. Government only gives them things when it's election time. it sounds very, very similar to where I used to work.
And one of the comments was that, like the electricity, that was one of the ways they got the electricity, was basically dealing with one of the politicians during election time, or they wouldn't have got it then. So, again, the very basics of what we would call necessities for life, it's just not there. And, this settlement, as I will call it, went as far as you could see back off over the horizon. And it's just... And those houses don't count in the population from what we were told.
Absolutely.
So who knows how many folks actually live in those? But it's breathtaking to see that many people living in those kind of impoverished situations.
Well, I think one thing that was also interesting was we had with us a resident of Nogales named Maricruz, who is a local activist and helped facilitate some of our stuff in country, and actually back on the United States side as well. One of the things she talked about is in many ways she talked about it as being preferable to live in the settlement as opposed to living in the government housing because of the freedom and and the ability to have a little more space and not be so limited and not be so regimented. So that there was almost two different sides even to understanding the housing situation. So, Jimmy, I want to pitch it back to you here for a second. I feel like I'm running Meet the Press. It's actually kind of what we're doing. I want to throw it back to you to kind of get two different perspectives on this, again, on the same question. And then we'll let Randy and Jimmy go. What is I'm not necessarily asking for your opinion, but what is your perception of why, what is your perception of the general understanding of why folks come to the United States? What is, in the Texas construction and in Houston, what is the perception of why folks come?
The opportunity is really the understanding that I have, and of course, that this is an understanding from no knowledge, basically, but my understanding from just what I've observed and what I've heard others that have worked side by side with these people in the construction industry is that a lot of them, they're very hardworking, they're very diligent. Most of them are working 2 jobs, not one. They'll work construction, because construction has weird hours. So you can work construction from 5 a.m. to 2 p.m. or 3 p.m. and then go to another job and work in the evenings. And so a lot of them work 2 jobs, and they're doing very dangerous work in a lot of cases, being up on a skyscraper. I watched one guy, we have a building next to, I work in downtown Houston, and we have a building next to us that's being constructed right now. And there was a guy on a ladder, 20 stories up, was strapped to the outside of this building, and he was just climbing up and down this ladder like it was nothing. And, if OSHA found out about this, they'd have a fit. But he seemed to think nothing of it. He just kind of like monkeyed up one side and moved the ladder over and then came back down to go somewhere else, and it was crazy. But he, just based on my observations out the window, he looked like the type. I mean, he was kind of him and the couple of guys that were with him. Like, they're definitely subcontractors, which means that they're the lowest of the low on the hierarchy within the construction, the actual construction phase of the project. And those are usually the ones that are if you're going to hire undocumented workers, that's going to be where they are. They're not going to be in the big name construction companies. They're not going to be
Sure, they're going to
the
be
ones that you've heard of. They're going to be Joe Schmo and his 5 guys, and you don't ask where the 5 guys came from.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of that kind of stuff that goes on. But I mean, that's really my understanding, that they come for the opportunity and the amount of work that there is. And I know that in Houston specifically, there's an area east of town that's referred to as the barrio.
Yeah.
Because it's such a high concentration of Latin American and Hispanic people. And once again, my understanding is that's also where a lot of the illegals live.
Sure. Yeah, that's where, I mean, as a lot of y'all know, I also grew up in Houston. And so, yeah, that's where a lot of the undocumented folks are. But I mean, I think if we did a map of Houston, you'd be surprised. They're kind of, everywhere. I would love to know the numbers, but I'm willing to bet that there's a lot of undocumented folks in Texas. Part of it's proximity to Mexico, and part of it is, that housing boom and that construction boom that's been going on my entire life, just about.
But I also know that in Houston, at least from my observations in Houston specifically, that in Houston it seems that there's not really a stigma about it. Like, It's not, you don't think anything of it. They are people. They are around. Like, you interact with them on a daily basis. They're just other people. And so I honestly couldn't tell you whether on these construction sites, whether they are, undocumented or documented workers, because they're the same. They're the same people.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in Houston, in our lifetimes, we'll probably be majority Latino.
We're almost, I think that Houston right now is it's no longer more than 50% white.
Sure.
And then the second is definitely Latino and Hispanic. And I think at some point there was a move for Houston to become and Trey, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this. I think it was something along the lines of a free something city where it really wouldn't matter if you were illegal; they just wouldn't care.
So basically, if I understand, it was a free trade zone. Like a specific like Nogales is in Mexico.
Like a sanctuary city. Yeah. Kind of how I understood it.
Sure. Yeah.
And there was a huge pushback from the rest of I think Houston was the one who was we kind of want to do this.
Yeah,
and the rest of the state was don't do that.
Sure.
Stop that.
So, kind of throwing that same question to Randy, having been and having met with, we met with a lot of folks who had made the crossing, were about to make the crossing, had made the crossing and got thrown back. What's your perception of why folks are making this journey? Because it's an incredibly perilous journey. What do you think's driving people here?
I would just probably call that boundaries on the extremes, because like you all were talking about, as we I have to throw in a little bit of economics here. Is the misconception in this country is the border is completely secure by a lot of people, but when you look at the scale of that I know. I mean, when you look at the scale of this wall, which is long, but you're still talking about 2,000 miles, and our country wants to all of a sudden take all these billions of dollars and extend this thing from San Diego to Texas, which is ludicrous on any given day. And then all of a sudden, and I do believe the church is making a really concerned effort to be caring and to treat these folks like God would want us to. But the other general thing is when you get into the aspect of just, I guess, the average common person looking at this dehumanization piece. I mean, they may think about it, but sometimes you have to hit Americans with the dollars, and they just don't see the dollars that our federal government is wasting constructing this militarized zone that's absolutely failing in every aspect. And I'm not naive enough to say that it's not making some positive things, I guess, in kind of controlling drugs and maybe some people who have criminal histories. But by the same token, when you look at the human side of it, if you look at these, we still, I think, want to call them detention centers, but to me they're just prisons. Maybe shorter terms than what we're used to. But the prisons these detention centers that I saw over there had more concertina wire and more secure facilities than most maximum security places that we're used to for the last 20 years. So putting that back into perspective, these people are coming here. They're not coming here for a party or for a vacation. It's at the extreme of their life where they have to come to survive, not next year. They're crossing that border and traveling that 25 or 30 miles from Nogales to Tucson just so they can put bread on the table for one day, and if they get lucky, save a few bucks to send back to their family. Because in most cases, it's become so hard for them not only to get here, but then once they're here, it's almost impossible in a lot of cases to get back to see their family.
Right.
So one of the things we've been told after 9/11, it's with the border improvements, if you will, or the restrictions, they don't have the ease they used to have just to go back and forth. So if they get here, we're almost imprisoning these people here now because it's so hard to get back. It's just a double-edged sword. It keeps getting to be more and more of a lose-lose situation, and these people are getting penalized because we can get away with it.
So
speaking from the perspective of someone that lives in Texas, I mean, I know that I have to be very careful in mixed company if something about this, which usually doesn't come up in regular conversation, of course, but if something like about, immigration comes up or the border. I mean, I know even at my church that one of the people that goes to my church lives in the valley, which is right along, Rio Grande Valley, right along the border. And so those are things you just don't talk about because at the end of the day, people that live, this is going to sound horrible, but white people that live along the border are very uncomfortable with the people that are not like them coming across the border.
Sure, that's something we noticed in talking to folks along the border is that same kind of thing, that a lot of times the border matters the most right on the border, right on that line.
And so you have to be careful about how, the people that you're talking to, I'd say that probably the majority, in Houston, we're a 10-hour drive from Mexico here in Houston.
Yeah, if that.
And we're not, we're not super close. We're right in that zone where we're far enough away that we're not getting people on a daily basis that we're like, okay, you crossed the border today.
Mm-hmm.
But originally, I'm from Miami originally, and so this whole idea of immigration is something that has been very prominent to me for a long time because in Miami you have a lot of Cubans that come to Miami, and they are treated completely differently from the way that Mexicans or while I lived in Miami, when the big boat of Haitians came over, and they all got deported. Even though they made it to the United States, because there's not a special rule for them, even though there is for Cubans. And so, in a lot of ways, it's just broken.
Yeah, I think that is.
About it.
Amen.
I think on that we can all agree. My final question for each of y'all, as in some form leaders in the church, obviously Randy as clergy, and Jimmy as a layperson, where are places where you've seen the church do this well in caring for migrant folks, or if you haven't seen it, what should churches be doing to care for these migrant folks in your perspective?
I'll let Randy go first.
Yeah, Randy.
My thing is, from a church perspective, I think my denomination, being Methodist, I think our doctrine itself and our book of discipline, things like the social principles, we've got the right ideas. And I think our leadership does an extremely good idea of putting things on paper and coming up with new ideas so we can help each other. But one of the biggest issues I have on that same line is communication out in the field. Sometimes the message gets there, and I think overall, I really do believe that our church, denomination-wide, is doing a very good job. But we are still just a small ripple in that water because it's so vast. But it just still takes a matter of doing frequent communication and not just listening to the statistics that we get off of the press and looking at real numbers and real people and listening to what they suggest, we can make it a better environment for both of us. Again, whether it's the ability to come back and forth, we can come over and work for a while and go back, and just trying to find a way to make the information that we're putting out there not to just to be some type of smoke and mirror kind of thing that is keeping the politicians and some of the other folks happy. I mean, again, we're dealing with real people's lives here, and I think the church is actually making a good effort there. But we can always do more. But there's a lot of just a lot of bad information where people may say, "Well, it's getting better," or "It doesn't bother me. I'm 1,000 miles inland. There's not an issue with migrant workers here." Well, coming from North Carolina, if you look at strawberries, or if you look at tomatoes, or you look with harvesting the poultry, Christmas trees. I mean, the Latino workers are everywhere doing a lot of very hard work, and it is a real issue for all of us, and we have to make sure that we're taking time to ask questions of the Latino people and ask them how we can help. And then it's going to come down. We're going to have to force the issue with the politicians, because we can do a lot of things ourselves, but ultimately to make change on a big scale, we've got to get the politicians to change these insane policies.
Absolutely. Jimmy, the same question. Kind of from your perspective in Houston, what is the church doing, and what can the church do better?
Okay, so I am also Methodist. I'm a lay person in a Methodist church here in Houston, and I will say that overall, I do think that the Methodist Church is probably doing a good job as far as how it frames this issue. However, I would point to my biggest thing on this has always been it needs to get to a point where it is not us and them.
Sure.
It is
That's
just
a good
us.
point. Yeah.
And this is something I've said to my church before, because we have a specifically a service that's specifically tailored towards and services, I should say, specifically tailored towards the Hispanic community in Houston, because we're fairly close to the line between the affluent, traditionally white areas of town and the poor, traditionally Latin American and African American areas of town. So we're like right in the middle. And so we're built by the rich white people, and the rich white people are trying to reach out to the not as rich, and by not as rich I mean very much not as rich people next door, but it's still very much seen as us and them.
I mean, that's not necessarily a negative impulse, right? That impulse to reach out, but it's it's how
I
you
think
do
that
it.
their heart is in the right place, and I think that the church body is approaching it from this is the right thing to do, and I think that I totally agree, and I think that the sentiment is good.
Sure.
But I think that the mentality that you have with that sentiment is equally important, if not more important, that you want them to be a part of your community.
Absolutely.
Not that you want to somehow give them some kind of charity.
Definitely. I think that's a really valuable perspective, and I want to thank both of y'all for coming on to SYN Boldly. I know this is a way different format than we are used to, and I appreciate both of y'all's perspectives, so thank y'all very much.
Thanks.
Thanks for having us.
Take care, Jimmy.
Thank you, Randy.
And we're back, this time joined by yet another cast of characters. This time I'm joined by Janelle and Ruth, who are two more of my colleagues from the Church on the Border seminar at Emory University. So the first thing I'm going to ask you is you guys can just introduce yourselves and tell a little bit about yourselves. Janelle.
All right. Hi, I'm Janelle, and I am a first-year student in the MDiv program at Candler. And I am from outside of Atlanta, Dallas, Georgia, not Texas. And I came straight out of undergrad, where I had been at Rhodes in Memphis.
Sure. And Ruth, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'm Ruth, and also a first-year MDiv student. I grew up in Portland, Oregon, and my family is from Oaxaca, Mexico. And I went to Willamette University in Salem, Oregon.
Excellent. So kind of going around, obviously you're on the Church on the Border seminar. That's kind of how I was able to rope you into doing this. But just tell me a little bit about how each of you, kind of same order, how each of you got plugged into issues of migration. What brings you to this issue in particular? Either from the seminar or also from before the seminar.
Okay. So for me, I guess a lot of it stemmed out of my commitment to working within the refugee community. And so during undergrad, I had been really heavily involved with the refugee community close to my campus. And I had taught just a kindergarten readiness class for refugee preschoolers, and had actually done a bit of research just about trying to figure out what organizations were involved with refugees, which churches knew about them, and what were faith communities specifically doing. And so I had a chance to do a lot of interviews one summer, and was fascinated to find that again and again I kept being referred to organizations that actually work specifically with immigrants. And so I had a chance to sit down and talk with quite a few people that are leading different things with the immigrant communities in Memphis, and just was really struck by the kind of the overlapping obstacles that these two different but really interrelated communities face, but also, you know, kind of these similar gifts too that they have to bring. And so I just realized that if I'm going to really live out this long-term commitment to working with refugees, I figured I really needed to understand issues of immigration a lot better than I did.
Sure, absolutely. And Ruth, kind of what plugs you into issues of migration?
Well, my parents came to the U.S. In the 80s, late 80s, and they relocated here, brought my siblings, and I was born in Portland, Oregon, but the rest of my family wasn't born in the U.S., so this is definitely a personal issue, personal investment. I guess I'll say that. And then just for my own identity formation, I really wanted to take this class and I guess really see myself in immigrants, because that's my family's experience, and yet it's not my experience because I'm in higher education. I'm in a grad program. You know, my life looks very different than the typical immigrant. So yeah, just personal development, and then just my family ties.
Sure, absolutely. In terms of, so we went on this trip. You guys have heard it talked a little bit on the show before. So we went to both Tucson, Arizona, and then we crossed over into Mexico and spent some time in Nogales, which is in the state of Sonora, which is basically right connected to Arizona. It's one of the kind of major points where migrants pick up the trail. And based on y'all's experiences, both in Tucson and in Nogales, how did your perspective change? What, if you had to really briefly encapsulate, because we can go on for days, really briefly encapsulate that experience, what changed for you? You know, and this can be whoever wants to go first. What changed?
Yeah, that is a great question, because I think we could go on for weeks, actually, rather than for days. So to distill that's really challenging. But I think for me, you know, as I said, coming from this perspective of really looking at things through the lens of refugee issues, I think that was one thing that was really kind of a poignant realization for me, was I guess kind of coming to see that in the U.S. we draw this hard and fast distinction between refugees who are here because of political reasons, with immigrants who are here because of economic reasons. And we make this into a really important category that determines all sorts of things, you know, determines what protection, what status, what rights are granted to these two different groups. And it was just really, really powerful to speak with people, you know, when we were in Nogales, to speak with men who had just been deported, and just to hear that, you know, in so many ways, like, I guess I just was able to conceptualize the fact that economic migrants truly are refugees, and just realizing that, you know, the way we categorize this refugee status is insufficient. And just hearing, you know, I think that when we talk about migration in the media, we talk a lot about, you know, why people choose to come. And so talking with these men that had just been deported, just was so struck by the fact that for them this doesn't feel like a choice, and that
what particular circumstances make it seem to them that it isn't a choice? Right.
I mean, I think that definitely varied from person to person. Thinking of one man in particular who was in his mid-40s, and so for him, I think a lot of it was kind of economics meets age, kind of the overlap of those two things, of that, you know, on the one hand, economic situation from the region in Mexico that he's from is really challenging, but then you throw in his quote age, you know, even though here in the workforce he's still, definitely would be able to get a job of some sort, I would imagine. But there, you just was saying that really over the age of 35, like there are really no opportunities for employment. But then, so that was, this man we spoke with in Nogales. But then say thinking about a young man, 18 years old, who I met in the detention center out in Florence, back on the Arizona side of the border. And just hearing, he came from a really, really violent region in El Salvador. And so there was, for him, the kind of overlapping factors that pushed him here was, this violence and the economic reasons. And that, as the 18-year-old son, he was the oldest of 9 children and felt this real responsibility to his mother, to his other siblings. But also this commitment to not want to make his living in violent sorts of employment, like gang-related activities. And so I think, just hearing the way that they spoke about it, not as if, I was dreaming to go to America and I wanted to, but more of like, no, like I love my home and it is this, this beautiful place, and that's where my wife is, or that's where my 3 daughters are, or that's where my 8 siblings are. But I had to leave. That was a big realization for me.
Absolutely.
And I think going along with that, like, a lot of people expressed wanting to go back home, not necessarily staying here permanently, but just being able to work and provide for families and then go home. And I think that's something that we discussed in class, that because the border is enforced more rigidly now, it's harder for people to move back and forth. And so people end up staying in the U.S. longer because, it wouldn't be viable for them to go home, come back and work, go home, and so it's just hard to explore sustainable ways of immigration because there's so many variables.
And also, I mean, I think for anyone, family is one of those kind of just fundamental things. Mm-hmm. You can think about, we heard plenty of stories of folks who just didn't see their family, not for like months. I think, I get a little antsy. Certainly my mother gets a little antsy if I don't come home in 6 months, right? If I'm not home, home in Texas at least every 6 months. I mean, I've been gone for almost 10 years, but even still, she gets a little antsy. She's like, she'll say on the phone, she won't mind me saying this. I miss seeing your face. We talk, we talk a few times a week, but I miss seeing your face, right? And so I think about that experience of my own mother and my own, migration around the country. And then to think about the folks we heard not seeing their family for 5, 10, 15 years. One of the migrants that I talked to, who had just been caught and sent back, was trying to get to Texas to be with his daughter, who's very sick. And he had been living in the United States for like 25 years, had children who were U.S. citizens, and then for complicated reasons that he was a little cagey on, and I can understand why, he was sent back to Mexico. He was deported. And he hadn't seen them in 5-6 years, and she was dying of cancer. And he was just trying desperately to be with her. Not even to, like, raise money to care for her, but just to be with his daughter in this time of need. I thought that was very impactful. That conversation I had was very impactful on me. So kind of building on that, Ruth, what was transformative? How were you transformed? How was your perspective changed by this journey? I like the knowing.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I think for me, the trip really was a way to see so many stories come to life. I mean, my parents, my uncles, my aunts are always telling stories of their lives back home, of their journey to the U.S., and that's an important narrative of me growing up. But I think to really walk in the desert, for an hour, to really go to a detention center and see what people experience there, and to really visit people and stay, have meals with people in Nogales and in Arizona and Tucson. All that was really bringing stories to life for me. And I think what that initiated in me was just like, I think it really served as a catalyst for me to want to become political about things, or to really take action in new ways. I think there's no way that I can do nothing about the immigration policies that are in place, about, just all of the issues that are tied to status and to the economic deficiencies that people are responding to. And on one hand, I feel overwhelmed, but on the other hand, I feel empowered, that there's something I can do, something small even. And so our class is doing final projects, and our group has decided to install a wall that will hopefully stimulate conversation and have pictures that will engage viewers to think critically about immigrations and the issues there, about the people, the stories. So, that's just one small thing, but I'm also trying to blog more. I'm trying to be proactive about using my voice in constructive ways around the issue of immigration.
What in particular, I know you obviously you have some connection to it just innately because of growing up in your family.
Right.
And that, I think, in a way that some people, I think, can hold the immigration issue out over here and say, well, that's over here, but I'm over here. I think you much more clearly see, how all of our lives are tied into issues of migration. What in particular did you hear in Nogales or in Tucson that gave you this inspiration to really take ownership of that issue for you? What was it that you heard in those conversations?
Something that made me cry was hearing someone who was just deported talk about his children. It was a dad. He was talking about how he was doing, he was embarking on this journey for his kids, and he was in the desert. He ran out of water, and he said, I thought I was going to die, but then I thought of my children, and I kept going. I kept walking. I just kept going. And to me, I felt like I was looking at my parents, I was like, wow, this is perhaps what my parents felt, perhaps what my parents experienced. And, I think that was just so personal. And then not just, I'm glad you talked about your mom, because I think there's something in us that I think wants to sympathize with people who want to care for their kids,
Sure, absolutely.
Yes, immigration is political, it's big, it's multifaceted, but at the core of it, parents want their kids to have good meals and a good education and to have a good job, they want their kids to have futures. And I think that just strikes the chord in me that's just human. So.
I connected the issue, especially of children. One of the things we saw, we spent some time walking in the desert. We hiked about 3 or 4 miles through the desert, which felt like a lot given that terrain. But one of the things we saw was the grave of a young man, a teenager who had passed away in that spot, or whose body had been found in that spot. And me and a woman from Nogales who was there with us, Mari Cruz, who I've talked about on the show in the previous segment, she stayed a little extra time at that particular gravesite. And that particular gravesite was really impactful on her. And me being the Boy Scout that I am, I always make sure to stay at the back or at the front to make, keep an eye on folks in case someone falls or whatever. So I kept Mari Cruz in my sidelines, and so we ended up walking side by side. And I leaned over, and she was clearly deeply impacted, and I was as well. And I leaned over and said in my best Spanish, which is not that great, it's always hard for me when they're young. And she went, yes, that always makes it harder. And to see both those who are trying to care for their kids and then the basically kids that make the crossing or attempt to make the crossing. I remember how punky and invincible I felt at the age of 16. But of course you're not. In some ways you're even more vulnerable because you're dumb as it's dumb. Sorry, any 16-year-old listeners, but you'll learn. I promise. Just it gets better. But that was definitely impactful. So we've been running about, just close to 20 minutes. So I want to ask you guys kind of a couple of closing questions that you guys can answer in however way you want.
Sure.
So it's kind of a two sides of the same thing. What is something that people should know that you don't think average people know about migration? And building on that, how can churches as institutions in our community assigned to care for all people be a part of either distributing that news or in caring for these people and bringing about kind of a more inclusive kingdom of God that doesn't care about such distinctions as nationality and status? So obviously that's a big question, and I expect you to have all of the answers in the next 5 to 6 minutes. So, not hard. No pressure.
No pressure.
Oh, no problem. I've got my whole thing written out right here.
This is a really well-scripted show.
False.
The teleprompters they're just up there. You can't see them.
Cue the applause.
We're ready.
Yeah.
Oh, goodness. I guess, okay, right now I'm kind of just wrapping my mind around the first half of that question.
Sure.
About what I wish we all talked about more, what I wish we knew. And I guess actually I'm drawing my answer for this from questions that I myself have been asked as I've shared stories coming back with my friends, with my family members. And it's a question that I keep on getting is, wow, those stories are really hard. Those stories are really sad. But at the same time, Janelle, don't you think we have to care for our citizens first? And, we can't be responsible for everyone. And, just kind of this question of responsibility. And so I think one thing that I just wish we talked about more, that I wish there was more awareness about, was just, the extent to which, the U.S. is complicit in creating a lot of the economic challenges, or if not creating, but definitely compounding.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so I think, we need more conversation about that. And then B, I think that there's this idea of that, we can't do anything about it because their government leaders are so corrupt. And while, I do not have the political expertise to say anything about that corruptness.
Most political systems are vaguely corrupt, whether they're in Mexico or the United States.
Exactly. I think for me, one thing was just really realizing, from the reading, not so much the actual trip, but just from the reading that we've done in this class and the discussions we've had, of just realizing, we as a country have built bridges for the capital, we've built bridges for the goods. And so, of course, we're, impromptu or informal bridges for people are going to spring up. And so we have a responsibility to tend to that and to make those bridges more humane instead of funneling them into the desert and into...
Or quite literally, they're expected to die.
Exactly. And so I think... I guess in some ways that's just my way of synthesizing, these stories from the trip, but then also, from, just this learning that we've had the chance to do, and just, really desiring to have more conversations about that.
Absolutely. Ruth, what is something that people should know?
One issue that I'm still thinking about and trying to figure out more about is how big of an industry the detention centers have become. And it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, a year. And even...
Yeah, CAA, which is the big one, it's like a $1.2 billion company on its own.
Yeah. So, that's just amazing how much money people are making off of, detaining people who are not criminal.
Yeah.
Legally, not criminal.
One of the key legal distinctions that I think you learn when you start to dig into this issue that isn't immediately obvious based on the conversation. It's not a criminal offense to be an undocumented migrant. Yeah. Theoretically, you should just, if you're caught, you should just get deported. And, it's an administrative kind of civil court matter with no criminal penalties. Right. And yet we have found ways to lock them up. And Randy has mentioned in our previous segment, lock them up in these things that look a lot like maximum security prisons. I've spent some time doing ministry in maximum security prisons. I felt like I was walking the line again. And so, I think that is an important distinction to point out.
Right. And just remembering, too, I was shocked when I heard this because there's so much media hype, but learning that the offense, of crossing the border is the equivalent of turning in your taxes late. It is the same type of violation.
It certainly annoys the government. But, I've turned in my taxes late before. Guess the IRS knows. And, the worst I got was hey, don't do that. Yeah. Which is really what it should be like. Hey, don't do that. You get deported. And then, you're probably, if the economy is strong enough, you probably will just try to make the crossing again. We found ways to criminalize it. And I think that is an important thing to point out. Really briefly, obviously this is a huge question that we can devote weeks on and have no firm answers, but what is something the church can do? In what you've learned, what is something that the church can do?
I guess just to my previous answer talking about bridges for humans, which sounds really cryptic, but I guess
I like the image.
I guess just the fact that, drawing from this image of the church, that, the church universal, I think that we are in a good position to really highlight those bridges. And, one image that really sticks out in my mind is this whole idea of churches meeting on both sides of the border and sharing the Eucharist together, like breaking the bread and communion wine. And so just this reminder that the border doesn't have to be a place of separation, but is a place where, where faith flows across it and, ideas can flow across it. And so just really, if we could tap into these, our universal roots, and I think also just with the powerful migration narrative that is so central to our faith, I think as well by really trying to highlight that, we can potentially really just help to humanize these conversations.
I definitely appreciate that. Ruth, obviously this is, as I said, this is a huge question. But
Yeah.
what's something that you think the church can be a part of?
I mean, it feels like a big ask, but I pray and hope and wish that the church would become advocates for immigrants, and that can, be a small gesture or a large one, and I think it can be anything from providing legal aid or, just an attorney or, connecting an attorney with an immigrant or providing spaces where immigrants feel safe and, if people can't drive to work, maybe starting a carpool list or there's just so many creative ways to engage with immigrants who are already here. I mean, yes, there's things that can be done at the institutional level, at the structural level, but I think everyone can also contribute, especially in the church, there's so many members can contribute like in personal ways as well. And, I really just encourage the church to use their God-given creativity to address the needs of people, of other people.
Definitely. Something I hear in what both of y'all are saying is this idea that there are no borders in the kingdom of God. And a kind of cheesy song that runs through my head when I think about this is there's a song called "Orphans of God," and I once first heard it sung by this wonderful choir of women who are in prison, and one of the lines in it is, "There are no strangers, there are no outcasts, there are no orphans of God." And I think right now the policies as they are and the way the church operates creates divine orphans. And we need to be a part of a movement to make sure that there are no orphans of God and that the church is not the one creating those orphans. So I thank y'all very much for coming
Thank
on.
you.
And, I hope to hear more from y'all in the future.
Thank you so much.
And I'm back with my final round of discussions. This time I'm joined by Parker and Hannah, two more of my colleagues from the Church on the Border class. And so, Parker, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yes, well, my name is Parker Ebling Arts. I'm in my second year at Candler, getting my Master's of Divinity. I'm hoping one day to be ordained in the Baptist or Methodist church, still figuring that out, but doing church work and making the world a better place any way that I can through the church. I'll tell you a little bit more about my story maybe later, but I come from Western Kansas, small town in Western Kansas.
Excellent. And Hannah,
Yeah, my name's Hannah Ebling Arts, and I'm a first-year MDiv
what is
student
a theme in the name?
at Candler, and we're married. And I am actually from eastern Kansas, so the other side of the
The
state.
civilized part of Kansas.
Yeah, sure.
Just kidding.
And let's see, what else? Well, I am really interested in community development and just where church and the world meet in the service and bridging those two.
Excellent. So I've been asking these questions of kind of each person that's been on. What brings you to this issue of migration? Obviously, you went on the class, and that will no doubt come up. But what brings you to seeing this issue of migration as so important to devote, a lot of time traveling to learn about it, and a lot of time to sit in a weird studio in Atlanta and talk about it? So what brings you to this issue?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So I have been working with refugees and asylum seekers in Clarkston, Georgia this year, and that's got me really interested in just like what does it mean to be a refugee and why are people refugees, and I've met a lot of immigrants through that process, and it got me started thinking about who's undocumented, who might be documented, and like what is life like when that's your situation. And so I guess it kind of started with experience, and I've been taking classes, and so Church on the Border, traveling to the actual wall was a really good next step for me. So I think it could be like a way that I see my vocation and my career looking in the future.
Definitely. Parker, what brought you to this issue in particular?
Well, growing up as I mentioned, I grew up in western Kansas in a small town called Scott City. I tell people a population of 4,000 people, 250,000 cattle. And there were many feed yards to house all the where all the cattle were held, and many Mexican migrants found work there. And so I grew up in a place where I interacted with, I had some Hispanic friends, interacted with a lot of Latinos, but I also saw how a lot of times there was this kind of stigma around people who were presumed to be undocumented, and a lot of times they were in ways they were excluded or looked down on by others in the community. And so yeah, I just wanted to see the border for myself, and put names and faces and experiences to this kind of hot button issue that I grew up around.
Absolutely. And kind of building off of what you started to allude to, what was transformative for you about this experience that we had? How did specifically in relevant to kind of communicating to folks who are listening, how did your perspective change from this experience, either from where you started at the beginning of the class or where you started long before you came to the class? What changed for you within that experience?
Yeah, go for it.
Wow. Well, there's
only easy questions.
Yeah, the trip in and of itself was all around eye-opening. You know,
well, I mean, let's start kind of we did a lot of different things in the trip. What particular experience within that stood out for you?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a story that I've told since coming back from the trip. I had one encounter that is especially vivid in my mind. We were visiting with people who had just been deported back from the states, who had been detained while crossing the border and been deported back to Nogales. And one man that I was speaking with, his name was Raphael. He was 40 years old, and he couldn't find work in Mexico. And so I guess because of his age and his lack of education, so he felt that his only resort was to travel across the border and look for work so that he could send money back to his wife and kids wife and children in Mexico. And so he was traveling across with a group of people that he didn't even know. He had hired a guide called a Coyote, and the guide was taking this group across, and as they were a couple days into the trip, he twisted his ankle. And the group decided to leave him behind so that he didn't slow them down. They left him for dead in the desert. After 2 days, he ran out of food and water and was just going from shade tree to shade tree and trying to survive. after 5 days in the desert, 3 days without food and water, he was found by the Border Patrol.
Oh, wow.
And he told me that he thought that he was going to die, but he just kept going because of his wife and children. That was the only thing that kept him going. And so just seeing firsthand the reality that and hearing firsthand how the perception is that the only option for some people living on the other side of the border is to cross the border.
Sure.
And it's not necessarily that they even want to be in the United States. They don't want to come and take over our anything.
Yeah.
They just want to come across, find work so that they can support their families, and they don't see another option for survival.
Definitely.
And they endure awful stuff as they try to cross the wilderness.
Well, and it's interesting that they kind of talk about two sides of the awful stuff that they have to deal with. And I often use a stronger language about that in my personal life.
Me too.
But that they talk about, obviously, the pain and the danger of crossing. That often these coyotes, the guides, will lie to them about how much water they should bring because they want to make it sound real easy, and it's not. I mean, we walked in that desert. That desert is out to kill you.
Right.
And so that journey is a dangerous and deadly 60 miles.
Right.
And they talk about that as being really difficult. And they also talk about the discrimination that they experience in the United States. That's something that I heard a lot in my conversations with them. It's like, we come over here and we are just treated like less than human.
Right.
And that has just a detrimental effect on the human soul. And the fact that despite the deadly dangers of the crossing and their full knowledge that they are going to be discriminated against once they get there, the fact that they still make that crossing shows you just the basic human need to care for one's family.
Right.
And the host family that we stayed with while we were in Mexico, over dinner one night, we asked them if they had ever considered crossing the border or going to the United States, and they said no, never. And we were surprised by that, because I think there's this perception that most Mexicans see America as
some sort of promised land.
Yeah, some kind of promised land where the grass is greener, and but they said, you're not truly free in America. And I asked, what did that mean? And they said, what did they mean by that? And they said that the friends and family that they knew that went to America, they said they don't own their own home. They never see their family because they're working long hours, and there isn't time in just kind of the structure of their lives to enjoy life at all. They don't have any true freedom. They're just a slave to their work.
Sure.
So, yeah, I think that's the perception that all Mexicans are coming across, because they have some false notion that America, because they want to be there and bed down there. That's not true for all.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, that's definitely something that I learned from this experience as well. And I like you, grew up in a place where there's a lot of migrants. I grew up in Houston, Texas, where, there's just, I remember this memory. I was 7 years old, and my mother and I were driving down the street to the camera store that was near our house, and I just saw Latinos running in the street, just like running as fast as they can, pell-mell, into traffic. And my mother looked at me and goes, "That's an INS raid." And I was like, "Oh." And I don't have a whole lot of memories from when I was 8, but that was 7 or 8, but that stuck in my mind. Yeah. I can picture that vividly. And I thought that is the strangest thing. My mother probably didn't say it was an INS raid, but she communicated to my 7-year-old mind that that's what was happening. These were undocumented folks who were running from La Migra, running from immigration folks. And And so I always kind of thought, oh, they want to come and stay. Just like when I was abroad, I wanted to come back to America. And to understand that really it's the economics that are pushing them here. And really, ideally, they would make X amount of money that they need and then be able to go back to, their families.
Right.
Which, my mother, I've told this in a previous segment, my mother gets antsy if I don't see her for 6 months. Imagine how I would be, or how any of us would be if we didn't see our family for years and maybe decades at a time.
I could not handle that. Yeah.
Right, we all get, a little antsy. Maybe it's a little more than 6 months for me, but I still, if I don't see my mother or my father in X amount of time, I'm even thinking about moving to a place so I can be nearer to my brother.
Yeah.
I think about this need to be with my family.
Yeah.
And to understand that making this dangerous, deadly crossing and be discriminated against and be separated from your family, I understand why they want to go back. Right. So thank you, Parker. I really appreciate that perspective. So Hannah, what was transformative for you?
Yeah, I think something that really sticks out to me, at least, was just the probably the positive moments of humanization that I saw. I'm so used to reading things and, of course, on the trip seeing a lot of instances of dehumanization, but we also heard stories from Mari Cruz about her granddaughter and their positive interaction with the Border Patrol when her granddaughter's paper airplane flew through the wall, and she thought, oh no, that's lost forever. And then a Border Patrol agent drove by, got out of his truck, and passed her the plane. And that just, I don't know, that was really redeeming for me. It just kind of reminded me that some people, everyone needs a job in this day and age, and some people find that job, like working for the government and doing border patrolling, but maybe they're not always horrible people.
Sure.
So that was really helpful for me to think about. I think another really impactful moment of the trip was when we went to the detention center and met with the legal representative beforehand, and he just shared about how hard it is as a nonprofit organization to be trying to help so many people, and only maybe 5% of Latinos actually get asylum status. Wow. And that's just overwhelming. And I think that in connection with the detention center experience we had in Arizona, just recently in Georgia, when I went and visited the Stewart Detention Center, I met with a detainee who was not from a Spanish-speaking country. He was from Jamaica, and he was telling me about, he said, wow, do you know how many people in here speak Spanish? And I said, tell me more about that. And he said, everyone here speaks Spanish. It's like everyone here. And he said, you know what else? And I said, tell me. He said, I bet it'd be hard to find one of them who's actually done something wrong. And this was so impressive to me. He just went on to share that so many of these men had been pulled over for a traffic violation or some kind of minor offense, where he himself, while also an undocumented immigrant from another part of the world, he had actually committed a crime. And so he understood why he was being detained. But he said, these men, they're just working and trying to provide for their families, and they're innocent. They shouldn't be locked up. And that was just a really redeeming moment for me to hear someone who's in the same situation as these other folks claim the innocence that people who are unauthorized or undocumented have when they're trying to just live and make a living.
I think that's something I saw in this class that I never anticipated seeing, is the changing perspective of the Border Patrol. We read a book before embarking called The Devil's Highway, that does a really, and I think I've recommended it in the show before, and I certainly recommend if you want to really kind of one book that's really going to help you dig into this issue. It's called The Devil's Highway. It is a very easy read in that it's quick, but it's a very tough read in that it's a very heavy subject.
Yeah.
But I absolutely recommend it for understanding the multifaceted nature of this, and to see everyone involved in this great human drama from a humane perspective.
Yeah.
But one of the things that book really reiterated to me is how the Border Patrol is going to do almost as much as they can to make sure that they don't find bodies.
Mm-hmm.
That they don't like finding people dead in the desert. And so if they come across a migrant, sometimes, yes, they are going to end up deporting that person, but they're also saving that person's life.
Yeah.
And some of them are really, really mean about it and are potentially terrible people, but many are not. And many are just think through, well, I have air conditioning in the truck, so let's crank the air conditioning up full, give them water, no matter what their thoughts on the politics of it or whatever. So many of them are like, let's just make sure these people are alive. We spent some time with this group called the Samaritans, who live like right on the border on the American side. And one of the things they do is they travel into the desert and try to help people along the way with some potential legal risks for themselves. I'm not going to name names and such, but one of the things they do if they find someone in really bad shape is one of the things they do is hand them off to Border Patrol, because Border Patrol can care for them and deport them, but care for them and keep them alive.
Right. And just on that note, I think it's important to paint the picture that the Green Valley Samaritans, like, that's a retirement community, and most of the volunteers, move from whatever part of the United States to Arizona to presumably relax and just take the rest of the life off. And here they find themselves like with this issue. They find dying migrants in their backyards, and what are they called to do? Like, regardless of their faith perspective, like, they're called to care for the person who's dying in their backyard. And I just think that's a really beautiful example.
Sure. I and one of the things they did that I thought was really cool in kind of adding that humanity to the people who are making the crossing is they collect objects that folks leave behind. And so you find, like, Bibles and letters. And I read through one guy's English homework. I sat there in this meeting, totally ADD and distracted. But I read through this guy's English homework, where he was trying desperately to learn a little bit of English. And just, the same exercises that I do for Spanish, that he was doing for English. And it really transforms that perspective. These are folks with prayer cards and English homework and shoes and just these articles of normal life that we run into, and so we've touched on this a little bit already, but for y'all, what are some things that folks listening to this who are not super plugged into immigration as an issue or immigration as a topic, what is something that you wish they would know that you don't think is obvious within this discussion that you wish they would know?
One of the most enlightening things that I learned was actually about something called Operation Streamline.
Tell me more about that.
So Operation Streamline is basically the government initiative to discourage immigrants who've come across the border more than once without documentation from returning. And so they're basically punishing them criminally rather than
simply a civil proceeding.
And sending them to detention centers with sentences of multiple months, maybe 150 days, with the hopes that they will not return because of this punishment rather than just sending them back over. But what they've found is that even though they're doing this, it doesn't discourage people from coming back. It just they just take longer before they return.
Then once they get back, they have a criminal record.
Right.
And so in the process of doing this, private detention centers are making tons of money. This has become an industry, and the people that are detained are put in garb that makes them look like prisoners, and some of them in these detention centers, some of these detention centers used to be prisons,
and many have been explicitly built to house migrants, which is another kind of follow the money kind of part of this issue.
Right. And so it's become this, there's this policy that's not really working, but costing tons of money and creating this unjust industry.
Absolutely.
And the people that are caught in it are just not treated well, and they're separated from their families, their lives. And one man that we talked to who was seeking asylum, he had been stuck in a detention center for 8 years. So I think advocating against Operation Streamline is just one example of a policy that is is not doing justice, not
Absolutely.
bringing justice that we can advocate against, and also just caring for the people that are stuck in the detention centers while this unjust policy is happening. And
Right.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Operation Streamline, I think, is not something that people understand that distinction between, and we talked about this in other segments too, that in reality, undocumented immigration is not a criminal offense. But many laws, including Operation Streamline and several laws in Georgia and in Alabama and in Arizona, are finding ways to give these folks criminal records and be able to punish them criminally as what they think of as a deterrent, which, as you rightly pointed out, it is not functioning as a deterrent. The only thing you might be able to argue is they're taking a little longer before coming back.
Yeah.
But in the end, the economic impetus to care for one's family, and that can be done much more feasibly by making the crossing into the United States, they're not thinking about their U.S. criminal record. They're thinking about their mother who needs a new roof, or their son who needs clothes to go to school, or their wife who's hungry and pregnant. Right? I mean, to me, I'm going to be honest, I would probably end up with a criminal record in that situation too.
Yeah.
Because fundamentally what I'm going to do is I'm going to care for my family.
Right.
So I think that's really valuable and something that is not really talked about in the discourse. So I appreciate that. Hannah, what's something that you kind of wish folks would know that isn't kind of immediately obvious?
Well, this might be immediately obvious, but I think while I have the platform, I just want to stop and say, like, no matter where someone stands currently on this issue, like, if you take enough time to look into it, whether you care about people having access to education, whether you care about family reunification, whether you care about, like, justice, whether you care about comprehensive immigration reform, like, there's so many different ways to, like, get involved and take action. I think, whether it's visiting someone in a detention center, you can look that up and be a part of a nonprofit that does that. Or, there is currently the DACA legislation that lets, well, it's not legislation, it's temporary, but it's letting...
executive order.
Thank you. It's letting children, people who were brought here as young infants who had no choice but have unauthorized status.
In an undocumented way.
It gives them a chance to be, like, to be lawfully present so they can attend school, attend college, have a job, be providing, because this really is their home, but they don't have
papers that lets it legally be their home.
Right. So I think, go ahead.
Well, and I think just generally helping to educate people who, think that immigrants don't pay taxes, or that, for example, around those assumptions, those common assumptions that people make.
So you want to explain more specifically about the tax situation?
Well, I don't know if I can do that.
We'll tag team.
To go into that deeply, but just this perception that because immigrants are maybe undocumented immigrants are don't have a social security number, they're not paying federal and state taxes, but in reality they're paying taxes every time they buy something, and
often the payroll tax is just automatically pulled out.
Yeah, but in their payroll taxes is automatically pulled out, but they're also not benefiting from the taxes that they're paying. And in reality, a lot of the studies that we've seen show that immigrants bring more to the economy than they take away overall,
and by a large percentage as well.
Right.
Yeah, and so just educating people around these issues. I think education is a huge component of helping people to see the situation in a different light, see it in its true light.
Absolutely. And so kind of my closing question, we've started to stray into this a little bit already, which is wonderful. Specifically looking at the church as an institution, and an institution in communities, and an institution where we look only at people, or theoretically should look only at people. What's something where the church can be specifically involved?
the church can start with the Bible. The church can talk about how in the Old Testament the call to care for the stranger is like present over 33 times. As God calls the people to remember, like, you were once strangers in a foreign land. And then in the New Testament, there's a very strong call to love the neighbor.
Sure.
And so if we just start at the Bible, which most people in church can agree on that being a pretty good resource.
I reckon so.
Yeah, I mean, that's my advice. Look at the Bible. Read what it says.
Sure. Absolutely. I like and Parker, obviously this is a huge question, but what is something, some place where you see the church that can be involved?
Well, gosh, I already talked about the education component, but I think kind of in the same vein of what Hannah was saying, that look at the story of God and God's people. When we look at Scripture, we see this main. We see that God's heart is for the people that are the most vulnerable people in society, whoever that might be, and we see that God's own people were people that were that didn't have a home, that were migrants on
themselves.
their own,
Absolutely.
And so we see that God has a heart for these people, and the importance of our call to care for them as well.
Right. And I think tangibly, like, once your church gets to the point of, like, okay, yes, there's a call to care for these people, I think you look and say, like, okay, what resources do we have to offer? Like, are we ready to make this leap? And, okay, do we have people who can do, like, pro bono lawyer stuff? Do we have people who can provide shelter or be a backup, like, when people are getting detained or something like that? Like, how can we be resources as human beings, and with, like, the financial or, career, whatever kind of resources we have, start rallying that and have a plan for your church to be present for these communities of undocumented people.
Absolutely. Well, I really appreciate y'all coming on. This has been a wonderful discussion, and thank y'all very much.
Thank you, Trey.
And with that, it's time to close. I realize I have gone this whole show without offering my own thought on what the church should do. I've thrown that in sidewise. But I think for me, fundamentally, the church is called to care. And specifically, the church is called to pastoral care to people who are experiencing this remarkably traumatic experience of crossing and of living in a country that discriminates against them solely so they can provide for their families. And so Hannah brought this up, and others have brought it up, visiting in detention centers. But I think it's more than that. I think it's outreach to migrants so that we can give them access to the resources they need, and that we can show them that there are people who do not view them as illegals, that there are people who view them as brothers and sisters in Christ and as fellow human beings along this road. That's where I think the church can be. There are no borders in the kingdom of God, and I think we can do a better job of making that outreach. And not this outreach of like, oh, let's convert them. Who cares? But let's show them that there are people that care. Fundamentally, that care for them as humans. Because I think that's what's lost in all the raging debate over walls and security and economics and whatever. Fundamentally, these are people, and regardless of what a nation state thinks, the church is beyond all nation states. So on that note, it is time to end. Thank you so much for joining us on this highly extended edition of SYN Boldly. Please give us feedback if you like this format. We can definitely do more episodes like this. So feedback, SYN Boldly at endfear.org, facebook.com/the Sign Your Name Project, and at SYN Boldly on Twitter. And go in peace to love and serve the Lord, and end fear by signing your name. Good night. We're so inappropriate.